We are live. Thank you for being here with us. I am really excited for this conversation. It has been a few months in the making since we were all first together to start discussing what is happening with DEI and how we can start to build this future potential vision, right? That takes us beyond perhaps the current conversations, the current experiences, good or bad, and thinks about this from even more faceted, complex perspective of healing, of growing, of nurturing culture and collaboration in the way that we want to see in the world. So I am very excited to have the guests with me today that are here. Today we are just kind of continuing on the path of that conversation. And so today we have named this future-proofing inclusion and focusing on the strategies, the narratives, the frameworks that are going to help us think about the next generation of DEI from this more broad and flexible perspective. So thank you for being here. Like I said, I'm very excited for this conversation. I think we have such beautiful hearts and minds that are choosing to be here together to talk about how they are addressing this complexity in their own work, but how we can all think about this together. If I have not met you or you haven't seen me before, my name is Yeruwelle de Rouen. My pronouns are she and her. I'm going to give each of the guests a chance to introduce themselves, but I just want to thank Cait Donovan, Dr. Nika White, and Zhou Fang for being with us today to, again, hold this space and to start this conversation and bring it more into the world. So I'm just going to let whoever is ready to jump in and share, and then we'll take a turn talking about who we are and how we connect to this space in this conversation.
I'm happy to jump right in and to kick us off. Thank you,
Awesome.
Yeruwelle. It's great to be back in community with each of you. So I look forward to this conversation. I am Dr. Nika White. My pronouns are she, her. And for the visually impaired, I am a Black woman in my late 40s. And I have sister locks, brown color, shoulder length, and I'm wearing a Black top and Black frames. And today I'm showing up to this conversation really eager to unpack some of what many of us are experiencing, but a little bit about me. I am the founder and lead principal consultant for Nika White Consulting, NWC for short, and we intersect the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion with leadership in business, working with all types of clients, different sizes, industry sectors, helping them to integrate into their business framework, strategic diversity, intentional inclusion, and a lens of equity. And the other thing that I'll mention is I'm also a 3 times author. My most recent book is Inclusion Uncomplicated, a transformative guide to simplify DEI, which was in partnership with Forbes Books. And I'll be referencing some of the insights that have found its way into that book. And so I thought I'd also mention that for our audience. And I'll pass it on to Cait.
I was gonna let Joe go first, but I'm Cait Donovan. I'm actually a burnout expert. I'm not a DEI expert. And when Yeruwelle asked me to come in the first time, I said, but I'm a white woman burnout expert. Like, what? I don't know that I'm the right person to do this. And one of the things that I bring to the table in this and every conversation is the biological underpinnings of the things that we're talking about. Why does it matter to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion on an actual physical level? What's happening in our bodies? My background is in Chinese medicine. I then did a follow-up degree in biobehavioral health. So I've done both the Eastern and Western version of medicine. And I think that what's important to know is that as we move forward with DEI, especially right now with everything that's happening and all of the squashing of DEI initiatives as they be, is that whatever's shifting now allows us to grow into what this is really truly meant to be anyway. The pendulum swings. It swings to both extremes all the time, and then we end up somewhere in the middle. We're swinging to the other side right now. That's okay. We stick to our guns. We head to the middle. We find the ground that can make the most impact with the most people. So that's what I think we're here to do today. Joe?
Thank you, Kay. Thank you, Dr. White. And thank you, Yeruwelle, for putting this together. And it's so nice to be here with you all together again. And my name is Zhou Fang, pronoun she, her. I am a consultant on intersectionality, leadership, and of course, equity and inclusion. And I think when we talk about next generation of DEI, we want to talk about what came before we can move on to the next generation. And a lot of the DEI thing that we don't talk enough about is a trauma-informed approach, because a lot of us do experience generational trauma that's passed down from previous experience and even from our parents, grandparents, ancestors. So here today, as we look forward to the next generation of DEI, I also want to emphasize on this is something my friend brought to me from California before. And it's a little button. It says, "Let's heal intersectionally." And I was so excited. I really loved seeing this little button. And it says, "Let's heal intersectionally." And I think it's really fitting for our topic today. So excited. Thank you.
Thank you for bringing your button. That is perfect and a lovely way to bring another smile to this conversation. Thank you all for those beautiful introductions. And I think it really does outlay the facets of complexity that we are starting to go into. As exactly Cait said, we watch this transform and shift, and we move along a journey path that leads us to more developed approaches to healing, more developed ways of understanding what's happening, and more hopefully developed cooperation, right, and how we can show up together. So what I have asked all of these wonderful humans and insightful people to do was to bring a concept, a visual idea that they would be willing and open to share with us today, to talk a little bit about how they think about and interact with this idea of the progression of a DEI working conversation in different spaces, from the biological, from the integration of our positionality and our identities, as well as from just the experiential that we're having every day. So what I would love for us to do, and I want this to be interactive, so feel free to pass your questions along in the chat as we go, and we will try to answer them. We want to have a conversation about these. So we're going to each have an opportunity to share an idea, a framework with you all that we use in our own profession and in our own life. And then we open that up for some discussion between the four of us, as well as all of you with the community. So please do add your comments and questions in, and we will try to get to those as we go. I think, again, I'd just like to open up and see if anyone's ready to dive in, if you're excited to share first.
I'm happy to go. I will share my little thing here.
Thank you.
Is it visible? Can folks see?
Pop up right now.
Cool. Thank you. I can see it. Hopefully, folks can see these visualization as well of the intersectionality framework. So just in context for folks who are not familiar with the framework. So the concept of intersectionality was first established and actually created in 1989 by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw as a framework to understand the oppression of Black women very specifically. And of course, with the span of like 30 years or so, the framework has grown and expanded into almost all areas in our lives. And intersectionality does not just examine a single identity someone may associate with or experience with, such as race or gender. Rather, intersectionality highlights what happens when multiple identities, sometimes a lot of them, when they collide and intersect. So here on this visualization of intersectionality, I invite folks to consider it as a function. So on top of a concept and a framework, to consider it as a function, a tool, a method, and a mindset, which is really hard to do, to kind of integrate intersectionality into our brain work. So the key words I want to mention here are interconnectedness, interlinks, overlaps, empathy, and curiosity. And this little imagery that we can see here kind of highlights the essence of intersectionality is we are all intersectional beings, and we have lots of characters, personalities, qualities, identities. They all intersect and overlap. And at times, our identities may change. Sometimes they will be amplified, as we can see some highlight on this graphic. Sometimes they kind of fade into the background. Over time, intersectionality comes with ebbs and flows. We can also see this as a way how we connect with other people. Sometimes you and I share some personalities or identities. Sometimes we don't. And that changes as well. So intersectionality can be used individually and, more importantly, in community and in family, at workplace, etc. So that is a visualization of the intersectionality framework. And I will stop sharing mine here.
No, feel free to keep sharing. Oh, it's okay. I was going to say we can talk about it, but that's okay. I want to just have a chat about that diagram and see, one for all of us sitting on this panel, what comes up. I know my company is called Intersectional Innovations because I believe that the positionality of people and this understanding of complexity is not only the root of some issues, but it is also, let's say, like the hope of the future is in the collaboration and recognition of each person in those individual aspects. So I'm wondering for Cait and Dr. Nika, what comes up for you as you are looking at this and hearing Zhou share?
Can I be really vulnerable? I was super judgmental on a plane last week. I was coming back from Minnesota, and I got on the plane and I happened to be able to get upgraded. So I was sitting in business class, and that doesn't always happen. So it's always an exciting morning when I can get chia pudding and coffee in a real mug on my way home. That's always nice. And so I'm sitting in my business class seat, and somebody came in and sat next to me. And before 10 minutes passed, I watched myself do this. I went straight into observation mode. Before 10 minutes had passed, I had made up 4 different versions of this man's story. Right? He had come in, he looked a little haggard, a little tired. He had real big headphones on. I have the same ones. So, I noticed his headphones. I made an assumption first that he was at a concert last night and trying to get home. Then I saw he was watching church on his phone before we took off. So then I was like, oh, he's religious. Maybe he actually went to a religious concert last night. And I went through all of these versions of who this person could be. And when I caught myself doing it and then I observed the process unfolding, I thought, we all do this automatically, whether we like it or not, whether we admit it or not, whether we're all doing this all the time when we meet people. And if we can keep a what you said, Joe, was this keep this as a mindset, understand that this is a function. If we can keep that in our minds, and I could make up all sorts of stories, understand that all of them could be wrong and all of them could be right. And it doesn't really matter. My job is to get curious if I want to know this person, or just leave him alone because it's a 7 a.m. flight and get off my back, lady. I didn't talk to him. I went into my own zone. But to remember that this gives us a way to be curious with each other, to explore each other, to find the ways that we intersect with one another instead of looking for the ways that we're different, we don't belong, we don't whatever, da, 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 da. So that's what that made me think of.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Cait. And also, thank you, Joe. I also have really appreciated what you shared. I think this is always an essential framework to bring to conversations of inclusion, equity, belonging, because the intersectionality framework is really critical for that. And I, too, really applaud Kimberly Crenshaw for bringing this to the universe, so that we all can get a bit more in depth around, as we've been saying, not just judging someone and considering their circumstances by one singular dimension, but all the many different ways that those dimensions intersect. A couple things are coming up for me that I like to socialize. I too am struck by the curiosity aspect that I think is critically important if we are trying to bridge the divide that sometimes difference can create between individuals. And I think that requires us to start asking a lot of really thoughtful, meaningful questions instead of always just gravitating towards making definitive statements. I think we need to spend more time asking questions, and not just asking questions as the starting point, but asking questions once we've already done our homework to build up our own knowledge, and then reflect on that information so that the cultural humility aspect can come into play. The reality is that none of us are like one-dimensional. There's so many different things about our lives and our experiences that causes us to show up the way that we do. And without getting to know someone, it is hard for us to leverage that intel about individuals in a way that really helps them to feel seen, valued, heard. And so I'm a big fan of amplifying one's intersecting identities and believing that no one group is a monolith, and letting that help to fuel greater connectivity as we are trying to be better humans and to center humanity in all of our interactions. The other thing that comes up for me is I think about how can we unjudge someone, right? Because it happens so naturally. As Cait has mentioned, it doesn't make us bad people that we sometimes, have a tendency for things to enter into our psyche and our mindset just based upon things that have been stored inside of us since birth that we have been exposed to. And all of those records that are being stored inside of us is not classifying the information as right, wrong, good, or bad. But we do come to realize that through some point in time that a lot of those generalizations, stereotypes, biases can be incredibly harmful. So the goal is to not deny that we don't have that propensity, but rather to recognize it, acknowledge it, and then to try to work to get better at it. Because when it shows up, we need to be able to have tools in our toolbox to know immediately, how do we now correct this in a very restorative way that allows us to take responsibility for the impact of the harm that it has created, right? And so that's what I like to contribute to the intersectionality framework that Zhou so brilliantly shared with us to open our conversation.
Yeah, thank you all. I wanted to add a little bit to this conversation from a different perspective about intersectionality that has always been very profound to me, from that perspective that you started from, Zhou, which is, how do you make this your regular way of being, of thinking, of interacting with the world, right? What are the intentions or values that you have to start from to get to that thinking and that behavior pattern? And I think what is important and sometimes missed around this theory is that, Kimberly Crenshaw is the mother of this theory, but the framework or the idea that sparked this for her comes from Sojourner Truth. And if you don't know who that is, please look her up. She is one of our phenomenal mothers of America that you should know. But what she talked about, one of her most famous speeches that I encourage you to read, is she says, "Ain't I a woman?" And the reason she asked that question is because when people talked about women, they talked about white women. Mm-hmm. And when they talked about men, they talked about white men. And when they talked about Black men, they talked about Black men only. So white women became the norm of what a woman was, and everyone else was invisible. We still see that today, right? With Indigenous women, with immigrant women, right? There's so many lists of these women who are invisible and silenced, and Black women are still one of those categories. And so I think that is one of the underpinning roots of this, is to recognize not just your own complexity, the complexity of others, but also to recognize there is a hierarchy of colorism and of gender, and that often people are just completely erased from the conversation, the data set, the research project, right? They are not in it. And that starts often from this idea of Blackness and the feminine being together. And I think that this framework, when you get to the value set, right, is asking us to address that within ourselves and to start recognizing not only the complexity, but the invisibility that is put on others based on the complexity of identity.
Yeah, Yeruwelle, I want to add something that's coming up for me that was sparked by what you just shared. First, I try to lean into the sense of responsibility in ensuring that anytime intersectionality comes into the conversation, of course, where we're crediting Kimberly Crenshaw, that we remind people of the genesis of intersectionality. While we know that we talk about it in a broader sense today, the reality is that when intersectionality was first used, it was really to talk about the experiences of Black women. And so I so very much appreciate you giving us an opportunity through what you shared to amplify that, because I think that's critical context for people to have.
I would add that it would do us all good to remember that the entire concept of self-care is also brought to us by Black women.
Yes. Thank you for that. Absolutely.
Let's just throw that in the pile while we're at it.
100%. And not just self-care, but radical self-care. That is, I have been talking about it, not just as self-care, but radical self-care. And that word, while it's quite intense, is very loaded. I think that it is necessary and appropriate for us to talk about it in that regard, because, you know, there's a radical cost to us not leaning into our personal well-being and taking responsibility for our self-care practices.
Thank you. Zhou, I wanted to kind of wrap up this beautiful discussion and point out that there was a comment made by one of the observers saying that I try to avoid flash judgments as much as possible. And I wonder if you just have anything to respond to that or to kind of bring this discussion together from your point of view.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you, Cait. Thank you, Dr. White and Yeruwelle, for your thoughts to it. And I think that's actually a very beautiful display of our intersectionality individually and then collectively. And I think to respond to, yes, absolutely. I see that Ruth shared, please include disability as part of the intersectionality and identity, 100%. I was briefly disabled this year, and I understand, you know, when one is disabled or experience disability, your whole perspective and experience of life will change. So I think that's also kind of a character of intersectionality, is it does change over time in our life. So thank you for calling that out, Ruth. And to address Ronan's comment, I try to avoid flash judgment as much as possible. And I think that is the mindset part of intersectionality. It requires a lot of intentionality as well as practice to be able to avoid things that don't serve us anymore. So that's a lot of like unlearning to do in our life as well. And I think for folks who have the intention to do better, just to generalize a little bit, is to put ourselves in their mindset. Oh, I did this before and I don't want to do that again. And that does not mean I definitely will not do it again, because we will as human beings and it's human nature. And I think it's important for us to be like, I will try my best. I will avoid. But if I do it again, I still have the ability to acknowledge it, and then we can move on and move forward together. So,
and I think this is exactly where talking about the biology and the neuroscience and the physiology becomes really important. I mean, your mindset about making a flash judgment matters, but you are making a flash judgment whether you recognize it or not. That's actually what we are built to do. We are meant to judge each other immediately, to say, is this a safe place for me or not? That's our brains are designed that way. So it's, I think, part of the issue and the reason we're future proofing at the moment is because people have felt, and I will say white people especially, attacked by this idea of, not me personally, I've done my work, I'm okay with this, but have felt pushed into a corner of like, well, you're doing the judging and you're doing all the things wrong and you're not thinking clearly enough and you're not putting enough intentionality into it. And so the message is, you're being a bad person. And that's not the message, not behind real DII work, but that's what happens. And if we can all remember that it is literally built into us as our little human computers,
Yes.
that we're gonna do that.
Yes.
we're gonna do those things, and we have to continuously pattern interrupt in a radical way, Dr. Nika, right? We have to continuously pattern interrupt and correct ourselves and catch ourselves and admit it out loud in front of thousands of people that we're making mistakes, so that we all remember the thing that's most important about all of this is that we're all human underneath it all.
Yes. I so love that. It doesn't make us bad people. It makes us human, but it also does not exonerate us from the consequences of our actions. And so the but there is really critical. And maybe it really should be an and. I'm going to replace that but with an and. And it doesn't exonerate us from the consequences of our actions. And what the outcome of that should be in practice for someone that really is about growth mindset as it relates to trying to minimize the harm that can be created through our human nature of bias creeping in, is to have tools in your toolbox, as I mentioned before, around what can I do when I have created harm for someone. And I think that that's an important conversation, an important upskilling that we also need to spend time, talking about. How do we help people to recognize how to disrupt that harm? And we first have to care and believe that when a person says, this has offended me, this has harmed me, we have to believe them. Yeah. And then secondly, we have to see it as part of our responsibility to try to restore and repair that relationship. So, asking questions like, what does support look like for you in this moment? And really understanding the impact of the harm on the individual is critically important as well. And that comes from curiosity and caring and just asking questions and that empathy that Zhou talked about a little bit earlier. Yeah, really, really good conversation happening here.
Well, who would like to continue us with sharing their framework? Nika?
I'm feeling some energy right now because Zhou did a great job of setting us up that, yes, I would like to take an opportunity to kind of go next. And I'm going to share something that is a little adjacent, but not necessarily directly aligned. And I'm going to get us centered here so that you all can see my visual. And by the way, while I'm centering this, just to let you know, what I am sharing is a chapter summary that is included at the end of every chapter of my book, Inclusion Uncomplicated, which I referenced at the beginning. But in this particular chapter, I talk about the power of storytelling. And that's really the framework that I want to share with this audience today as we think about the next iteration of what DEI should look like, feel like, and how we can navigate this very complex terrain that is upon us right now. And when I talk about the power of storytelling, I think it's important for us to realize that we all are neurologically hardwired for stories. We respond to stories. Stories resonate with us, especially when we're listening to those feel words. It causes us to deepen our empathy, deepen our compassion. And through that, we are building trust, we're building rapport, we are showing vulnerability, which is giving others permission to also lean into their vulnerability and feel some sense of safety and sharing their stories as well. And everyone has a story. If we relate this very specifically to DEI, everyone also has a DEI story, whether we realize it or not. And when I use the word story, I'm using that broadly to talk about, personal narratives or any type of exchange where we are allowing people to get a bit more proximate to us, our inner thinking, our experiences, our background, our culture, our heritage, our lived experiences, all of those things. And the reason that's important is because when we can get to a place to where we are bridging those connections, where we can commune with others, where we're feeling as though they understand us a little bit better, it allows us to feel a bit more accepted, a bit more seen and heard and valued. And that becomes really critical. We make a lot of assumptions right now about other people. And when we allow ourselves to hear stories and to share stories, we're helping to shift those perspectives because now we're learning something new and different that perhaps has not historically found its way into our consideration set. I think about what makes an environment conducive for people to feel inclined to share stories. And a lot of it is about that strong sense of psychological safety, right? We need to be able to know that our stories count, that we're not going to be judged for our stories, or not going to be any repercussions or negative implications from us sharing our truth. And that's a hard place to be when you consider that a lot of workplaces do not prioritize psychological safety. And so I bring that to the conversation. What I also think is a great opportunity for us to lean in more on is we are accustomed to storytelling as being a tried and true way of just creating connections. There's a reason that parents at night, when they go to tuck their kids in, or guardians, to not tuck their kids in with the promise of, I'm going to share with you, some bedtime facts from this report. But we're saying, I'm going to share with you a bedtime story, right? And so stories they're really a great way to connect us to one another. But I think that the upskilling around storytelling is equally important. It's not just about us telling our stories for the sake of hearing ourselves talk, right? It is about pausing and being thoughtful. Why am I sharing this story? What is the purpose of this story? And the reason that I bring that to the conversation is because a lot of times the trepidation in sharing stories is because we're thinking, am I oversharing now? How people are going to perceive me if I go really deep into this very vulnerable story? And what I often tell leaders is that if you can, with great conviction, answer the why behind the story, and that why becomes really important of an outcome, then yes, you should tell that story. So for example, is your purpose and your why for the story because it's going to help someone understand you better, which is going to help bridge those connections and help people to understand, again, how you show up to the world? Is it going to help someone be able to support you better, right? Because we know that we need support, and support from one person to another can look vastly different any given day. Also, am I sharing my story not so much for me, but because I know that somebody in my midst, they're dealing with a similar situation, and I want them to feel seen. I want them to have value and understanding that they're not alone. So if you have trepidation about storytelling because you feel like it could be oversharing or exposing yourself, then I always say, think about the why and the purpose. And if that outweighs whatever type of discomfort that you're having, then go for it and try to get that story out to the world. The last thing that I want to share too is, as I mentioned before, storytelling is not a new phenomenon. It is a tried and true, proven way to create connectivity. What I'm not seeing enough of, though, are corporate spaces adopting a storytelling culture where they are very intentionally trying to embed this into their day-to-day practices, into their meetings and interactions, as a way to bridge the divide that could be created through the lack of connectivity, the lack of maybe psychological safety. And I think that is to the detriment of business outcomes. There are business reasons to incorporate a storytelling culture into your organization. There's a lot of significant business outcomes there. Not only does it build trust and build support and community, it also allows us to just be able to, in some regards, walk a day in someone else's shoes. And again, that deepens our empathy and compassion. And I think that those are some leadership attributes right now that are not showing up to its full potential. And so that is my soapbox for today. And that is the framework that I'm bringing, is leveraging a very intentional storytelling approach to be able to bridge the opportunities of greater connectivity, which I think can help us to navigate this terrain of complexity that comes along with diversity, equity, and inclusion, belonging, all the things. And so I'll yield with that.
All the things, exactly. Thank you. So such a lovely bridge too to the traditions that we've had as humans, again, and to how they actually support the business story and case that we were trying to make and improve within our spaces. Something I always talk about, honestly, is that, we have data. Our society's been really good at collecting and categorizing data for generations. We don't need any more data. I mean, we do. We need to keep up, right? But we need the qualitative story. We need to know why. Like, we know what. The data says what. We need to know why. And that's that part of curiosity and trusting others, listening and believing their stories, right, that we're missing within most of our very corporate, even just regular organizational systems.
Yeah, you're right. I appreciate that. Our society values quantitative data more so than qualitative data. And I think that that is an unfortunate imbalance because, again, to your point, so much can be gleaned from someone's story, from hearing the feel words and seeing the expressions and the body language in which, you know, they are sharing their stories that they're incredibly passionate about, or that really have left a strong impression on them. And when you hear those feel words, you can't help but to want to deepen your care and concern. And then is when we can focus on humanity, because it's no longer about there's a resource in front of me that I am giving instructions to go and do some type of output or create some output. But now I'm talking to a person with feelings and a person that maybe is afraid or disappointed. And that lands on people much differently.
I was thinking about this from the space of when I was in school for my Chinese medicine degree. For those of you who don't know, Chinese medicine is a master's degree. It requires 4 solid years of a master's program. And while I was in that program, I read all of the books written by Louis Melmadrona, who is in the indigenous community in the United States. And his stories are about healing.
Mm-hmm.
One of his books is called Coyote Wisdom. Another one of his books is called Narrative Medicine. And his books are about how the stories we tell ourselves heal. So as much as we require this from the workplace, I think most of my own personal DEI work has been the stories that I'm telling to myself about myself and about the guy that I see on the plane. And about what are the stories that I'm taking with me when I enter that workplace that are changing the stories that other people can share because of the things that I think, right?
Yeah.
What's that inner story that really matters? So I think that it's important to remember that narrative is healing on a collective scale and on an individual scale. So this is such a, like, I could cry with joy listening to you saying how you want to put this into workplaces, because there's nothing older or more profound or has more actual scientific data to back up the fact that it matters than storytelling.
Yes, I agree. You're reminding me, Cait, of the timeless and wise words of the late Maya Angelou when she shared that, and I may not, I'm paraphrasing here, but it was around the fact that there's no greater agony than bearing an untold story and just keeping it inside of us. And we know that through her story and her life, when she released, you know, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, it was all about her story, right? And that's when she became liberated. And through that liberation, so much goodness and magic was able to be created. And I think that the same can apply to each of us. There's a reason that talk therapy is something that is very prevalent in today's society, especially around the mental health concerns that so many people are holding and having in their consideration set. Because when we are talking, we are sharing personal narratives and stories, and that, you know, certainly gleans a lot of information that can be useful for the healing process. And so I'm glad that this is resonating with you.
Yeah, I will just I really appreciate the story component to DEI work, Dr. White. I think everyone has a story, as we all know. And I think briefly mentioned here is my personal understanding is when we talk about data, we always focus on numbers and quantity, etc. I think perhaps it's because our society is designed to cater to an audience that appreciates data and numbers more. And I feel perhaps that has something to do with the patriarchy. Because I feel when it comes to qualitative data, it's about a feeling, it's about a recalling, it's about a memory, it's about an experience. Oftentimes, it's not about how much money we make. It's not really about how many years I have contributed to this company and then I'm going to retire, I'm going to have a pension. So that's usually not how, when we think about story, that's we think about experience, emotions, memories, etc., and family, community. So I feel that's the feminine side of it, which we oftentimes don't talk enough about in today's society, is because we live in a very patriarchal system here. So I really appreciate you mentioning, everyone has a DEI story. And that is to kind of wake up our storyteller inside. Your grandmother, what's the story she told you? Your abuela, like what did they tell you about? I think history is passed down by the women in our life, and I don't want to gender our ancestors much, grandparents or mother, father. I don't want to gender that. So I want to focus on the femininity side of storytelling. That's the kind of takeaway I have from your framework, Dr. White.
No, that's beautiful. Yeah. And as I close out my portion, I just want to acknowledge what Ronan has shared and stating, I believe we value quantitative more, but are more easily swayed and manipulated with qualitative. I 100% agree with that. Thank you for contributing, Ronan.
Thank you all for contributing. It's such a beautiful conversation. And now I'm excited to hear from Cait and to see how, again, the human aspect of biology sets us up to think about this.
All right, so this is a very simple picture. Everyone knows what it is. I got it from Canva. It's no surprise, right? But the concept behind this, and the thing that I think about when I'm considering a picture of health, is something that's called a web of causation. Now, the web of causation the idea was developed in the 60s because people were, being told that they're getting diabetes only because they were eating sugar, for instance. And what we learned was that it was, some sugar, some lack of movement, particular job places, particular emotional experiences, particular access or lack of access to quality food, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And also, cultural differences in foods that were eaten, and we could go on and on. So it turned out that there were all of these various factors that came together in order for something like diabetes type 2 to develop, right? We're not talking diabetes type 1 at the moment, but diabetes type 2. And I think that I use this same web of causative factor worksheet when I'm doing burnout work with corporations, for people to remember that when somebody is coming into your office, they have a web of factors, some positive, some negative, that are going to make them either more or less vulnerable in your workplace. That's the same when it comes to psychological safety. And I think this is the part that people are consistently missing. Some of us, because of the way we look and the way we were raised and the privileges we had, feel more psychologically safe just because.
Yeah.
Just because. So those people going into your workplace and saying, well, it feels psychologically safe to me, might not be your best canaries. Right? We have a different perspective because of our life experiences. So I think that we need to understand that people are bringing with them a whole host of other experiences. And this is a hard thing to talk about, but sometimes when someone has been experiencing microaggressions, I kind of hate the word microaggressions because it feels like a lot of them are just macro, but microaggressions and macroaggressions, various aggressions and various ways that they have been shoved into boxes and pushed aside and not respected and et cetera, et cetera. When that happens frequently over a long period of time, a couple things happen in your body and in your brain. One of them is that the center of your brain that deciphers whether or not you're psychologically safe grows and becomes hyperactive and hypervigilant, which means that a company can do everything in its power to make something psychologically safe, but the color of the shirt they were wearing is the same exact color of the shirt that woman was wearing that day that she did that thing to you. And you're going to be reacting and feeling unpsychologically safe in that moment for some stuff that A, you may not remember, B, you are over interpreting, you said before, Dr. White, that, we have to believe people when they say that they've been hurt, and we do 100%. And people that are consistently hurt need to review their stories, because their brains might be priming them to over-interpret situations because they have the proof and the evidence in the background that that's what that might mean. They're not wrong. And this situation might not be that. So there's an interplay that I think we all need to understand on a biological basis of what we have to do as people in places of privilege is 5 times more than what we've been asked to do already.
Yeah.
It's not less. We're not changing DEI. We're not future-proofing DEI to make it easier for white people. White people, we have to do 5 times more because of what's happening in the bodies of the people that we have been repressing. And I think that to understand that, we need to understand that everybody is a web of causative factors. And we're never going to know all the pieces of their story because they don't know all the pieces of their story. People that burn out don't know all the reasons that they burnt out. You don't even remember. Some of them are, like Joe said earlier, intergenerational trauma. You might have some changes, some methylations to your stress genes that make you more susceptible to stress because of some stuff that your mother went through, or your grandmother went through, or your great-grandmother went through. We know that this happens for at least 3 generations back. Chinese medicine claims 7. So you don't even know your whole story. So I think the job is for those of us in privileged positions to do more than we've been asked to do. That's number one. And I think the job on the other end, the other side of the aisle, is to understand the stories you're taking with you are affecting how this psychological safety plays out. So we have to figure out this psychological safety together as a community. We're never going to figure it out as we still stand on 2 separate sides of the aisle. It's never going to be figured out that way. We have to figure it out together. So narrative storytelling in the workplace, I mean, that's a healing moment. That's what I was just like, that weaves a web that heals.
Yes. Yeah. I don't want to jump in too quickly because
Jump
Cait,
in.
I want to give you all of the space.
Please jump.
To let your zone of genius continue to shine forth, because what you're sharing resonates with me. And let me just express this, by the way, and all of us here that are part of this panel, we can attest to this. Before our audience, we did not connect ahead of time on what each of our frameworks we were going to share were going to be. But the connectivity that is beautifully woven together through the sharing of intersectionality and the importance of that as a framework, as well as the storytelling aspect that helps us to understand more about people's intersecting identities and how that's impacting them and all of their stories to help connect greater level of bridges being built to help cultivate relationships. And then thirdly, this web of causation that is just reminding us of this collective opportunity and challenge that we all share in trying to make us better, because the word baggage kept coming up for me. And I know that has such a negative connotation associated with it. And we talk about it often as it relates to relationships that are outside of the workplace. But let me tell you that baggage also finds its way into the workplace. And sometimes I think that unfairly, a great deal of the responsibility is placed on the organizations to try to fix that, when in actuality, what we're talking about is that this takes some deep inner working on the part of a lot of the individuals that are in the organizations as well. So it certainly is much of a collective kind of shared challenge. And I appreciate so much, Cait, you bringing that to the conversation. We have to be aware of our own triggers and create our own boundaries, because we know that boundaries are for us, not for other people. So anyway, thank you.
Yes. Yeah, thank you so much, Cait, for sharing your framework. And thank you, Dr. White. Psychological safety. And I feel like I think my thought right here is bring back the button.
I do love that button.
Let's heal intersectionally. And I want to address, Kate, you mentioned white people. If you consider yourselves an ally, a conspirator, you need to do more. And I agree with that. And I will add to it is white folks also need to heal.
Yeah.
Trauma shows up very differently for folks who have different identities.
Yes.
We all have intersectional identities and we all have our unique trauma. Sometimes the trauma is shared, sometimes it's not. And I remember, and I'm probably not quoting it correctly, is James Baldwin said something about, yes, there are oppressors, there are oppressed. The oppressed, of course, suffer economically, education, status, etc. The oppressed suffer. At the same time, the oppressors also suffer. And what is their suffering is the lot of like, are you morally, and sometimes they are not aware of the suffering, but it doesn't mean you are not suffering.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So this is why I burnt out personally. Right. I didn't grow up in a financially safe environment, but in all other standards, I had two parents that were both working, that were together. My father had a lot of addiction issues, sober since I was 6. And I always had all the food I needed to eat. I always had a place to live. I had a good community. We had all the things. And it took me until I burnt out to look back at my story and say, oh, there's a significant amount of trauma here. But when I say that we as the privileged people need to do the work, that's what I mean. Do your own inner stuff. Don't be afraid to come on a talk like this and say, I was judging somebody on a plane last week and I shouldn't have been that, this, you have to, part of that doing more is the doing your own work and understanding that you have healing to do as well around a million things. This whole thing, obviously not going through it, but when I have people go through this exercise, these are all the different things that are burnout risk factors. Yes, there's a section under culture that says the isms, because that really matters. But the rest of this does not see privilege. The rest of this hits everybody. It hits everybody. It doesn't, you are not safe from this list. Some of the things on this list will hit you and make you more vulnerable to burnout. Those that are more vulnerable to interpreting their space as psychologically unsafe are the same people that are more vulnerable to burnout. It's the same group, folks. It's the same group, but we do have to do that work of working through as much stuff as we can, because we're never going to get through all of it. I meditate every day, folks, and I'm 42 and I have a lot of ground to go before I would say I'm healed. But I have to know that about myself. I have to know that so that when I do start judging that person on the plane and I have that moment and I think, oh gosh, I don't want to be this person, I can go into self-compassion in that moment, instead of self-deprecation, instead of self-judgment, instead of self-flagellation.
Yeah. What really stood out to me in what you shared, or there was many things, but one that I thought was really beautiful was just the idea from Chinese medicine of 7 generations behind in healing. And in my own life, I had a Lakota woman, as I was sharing with her my own journey for intergenerational healing in myself and my family line. She shared that in the Lakota beliefs, they believe that in order to heal your generation, you have to heal everyone in your generation, and then it starts to heal 7 generations behind, 7 generations ahead. Number one, that hit me hard because it made me realize that even deeper than I already knew, that healing is in community, right? It is individual awareness and self-awareness and accountability that then allows you to see the system and to work in the complexities and collaboration with others and to see them. And I think it's something we miss a lot. It's something that, frankly, I center my work in all the time with my clients or in my communities is, what is the intergenerational impact we're trying to make? Because whether we want to or not, we make one. We are always leaving a mark. And I think that key that you have centered us in is that awareness of that web, in self and in others, and to recognize, that awareness starts the ability to get into these other spaces of new agreements, new practices, new behaviors, right? As we're able to move through that. So I just really appreciated that share.
I have one more thing that I'd like to take a moment to sit on together, to think on together, is this idea that you brought up, Dr. Nika, earlier about, when you have caused harm, find a restorative practice. Amen. Mm-hmm. And when you're doing the inner healing, when you're doing that kind of work on a deeper level, my ask is that you pattern interrupt before you cause the harm. And you do a restorative practice even if no one else knows that it's happening.
Yeah.
Right? Like when and I'm going to use the plain example again. When I noticed I was doing that, right, to this like poor, very tall white man sitting next to me who probably didn't have any of the things that I was talking about. When I was doing that, I stopped. And I played a game that I was taught by a friend called my friend Shamus Pitts, who says the Just Like Me game. This man is just trying to sit on his plane, just like me. He's just trying to get to where he's going, just like me. He's just trying to get his breakfast done, just like me. The Just Like Me game is a restorative practice that I play within myself for other people without their knowledge. Mm-hmm. Right? So my ask for everybody today is to catch yourself on the edge of harm when you can, before you induce it, when you can. And don't just stop yourself, still engage in the restorative practice. Do a metta meditation, send somebody love if you have to, light a candle, whatever it is you want to do. They don't have to know about it, but you have to know about it, because cleaning up your energy that way, that's how we create the web, right?
Yeah.
That's all, folks. That's all I got.
That is so good. That is so good. I know that we're out of time, but something that I want to socialize that I think adds to this discussion, and Cait, you referenced this before, but in the context of doing the work of DEI, practitioners that are in this space, whether you're actually as part of your title and your job description, or even if you're just an advocate and a champion of DEI principles, most often a lot of those individuals who are professionals in the space, they belong to marginalized communities. And we know that marginalized communities are often faced with disproportionate burden in society. So that's where that radical self-care that we talked about earlier becomes really important, so that we can avoid burnout and we can leverage tools and strategies to help us to counter some of the effects of systemic racism, discrimination, trauma, all the things. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that, of course, as a Black woman, I do care deeply about the Black woman's experience. And I'm singling them out because my lived experience has definitely been one of face-to-face with burnout. And we know that Black women have a disproportionately higher rate of chronic illness, morbidity. Oftentimes, all those illnesses are related to stress and the burnout. And so sometimes this also becomes a life and death type of conversation. So I just want to really amplify the seriousness of which this conversation has been brought to today's discussion. And I really hope that it's resonating with some folks that can take heed and maybe change some of the practices to better care for our well-being.
Yeruwelle, you're muted.
You can't unmute.
I don't think she's gonna. Okay.
I thought that was just such a beautiful place to stop that I just didn't want to say anything else.
Well, great. We're thinking maybe there's a little bit of technical difficulty that's causing Yeruwelle to not be able to unmute. But I'm going to close us out then. Of our dear friend who was so instrumental in bringing us all together again. Thank you all for taking the time to share. We hope that if this information resonated, that you will share it out with someone else in your network. And we just appreciate your time. And so thank you all so very much. And thank you for the opportunity, Yeruwelle. It was great to see both of you again, Cait.
Same. Good to see you.
Absolutely. All right. Take care, everyone. Your evening.
Bye.
Are we supposed to stay? No? Bye.
It's still showing live. I don't know why.
I guess we're supposed to say goodbye. Put yourself backstage. How do I do that? And live.